Hey, what's up guys, it's DarkArmedDuelist, and today we're going to be doing some Ghostrick test hands. So I'm really excited for this one because this deck is a deck that I haven't actually done test hands of before, and it's a really awesome deck to be able to do test hands with because it is super fun to be able to stall out your opponent. I will mention you guys, a lot of the test hands I'm going to be showing you how to stall out your opponent and be able to use a lot of the resources in the deck to be able to show you how you can get those mills out of your opponent's hands, which is going to be the main focus of this particular test hand. So without further ado guys, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell there so you can become part of the notification squad, and definitely check out the Patreon down in the description below for all those awesome rewards you guys, like getting your name description in a single video, getting a signed card in the mail, or even getting to request a deck profile every single month you're a patron along with test hands. So without further ado, let's get straight on into this. So like I said before, this is pretty much a skeleton mill build, which is what's really interesting about the deck. And I can show you guys the first turn, second turn, third turn that you're trying to go into to get all that advantage against your opponent, to be able to get all those different plays against them, and ultimately mill them out and be able to deal with all sorts of crazy plays. So I'm actually going to really quickly move some dice up here because we're going to use these dice as different markers to kind of signify how many cards we've milled out against our opponent. We're going to count them in fives with these to be able to just go in and see how many cards we can mill out against our opponent and how quickly. Usually we're going to mill out at least 30 cards. I usually haven't gotten more than 30 before. I've milled out 40, but usually my opponent's going to, on the second turn, go through a bunch of cards in their deck, and they start out with 5 as well. So you always got to consider that they're going to have 5. Let's go ahead and have all the dice up there, but you're usually going to keep in mind that they're going to have all those cards that they're going to be getting rid of on their first turn as well. So let's go ahead and shuffle the deck up and see what we can actually pull off. So this deck, like I said, it's very interesting. If you're looking for a deck to have a lot of player interaction, this is going to be a deck for you because you're going to be doing a lot of stopping your opponent, effect veiler type, or not, battle fader type effects, and you're going to have a lot of mirror forces and stuff like that, just to be able to stop your opponent from all sorts of different plays, flip-flopping your opponent's monsters, and it's just an overall really fun deck to play, actually. Maybe not quite so fun for your opponent, but really fun for you. So let's go ahead and shuffle the deck really quick one more time and see what we can do for the first test hand. This is right here where I'm going to put the counter for how many cards I'm potentially going to mill. So we're going to go ahead and draw, and we're going to go draw into a copy of Mansion. That's fantastic. Allure of Darkness is going to help us dig into the deck. Storming Mirror Force, a copy of Lantern, and a copy of Spectre. So this is not a bad hand at all. I will mention you guys usually want to go second, but if you do get pushed to go first, it's totally fine. So we're going to act like we're going first. So we're going to go ahead and immediately activate our copy of Mansion. Mansion is very important to immediately get on your side of the field to be able to just stop your opponent from attacking your face down monsters and dealing with your cards. We can then set a copy of our Storming Mirror Force on our side of the field and then allure for 2. When you allure for 2, you're going to draw into another Mansion and a copy of another card, which I'm going to go ahead and banish the copy of Spectre off my side of the, or out of my hand, because I don't really need it. We're then going to go ahead and allure again to draw 2 more cards, and we're going to draw into another copy of Lantern. Now we haven't gotten through the deck a little bit to be able to get to another copy of Lantern, and if you want to, you can set that copy of Lantern or leave your field plain if you want to let your opponent kind of bait. Set that 1 card on your side of the field and pass. So when your opponent goes and they attack you directly, you can once per turn, when your opponent's monster declares a direct attack, or when you control a Ghostrick monster is targeted for attack. If you do, you can special summon this card in your hand and face down defense. You can either use this, or, which I usually would, I would usually special summon this to my side of the field, and then immediately after, I would Storming Mirror Force my opponent to shuffle the monsters back in their hand and get them off the field. Now, when this is sent to the graveyard, I'll draw into next turn, and when I draw into a Quaking Mirror Force. Now, this is really good. I'm going to go ahead and set this to my side of the field, and if my opponent doesn't have any link monsters, you can just go ahead and use your Swords of Concealing Light to be able to stop your opponent from summoning any monsters, or well, they can summon, but any monsters they currently control, which should be 0, could just be flipped face down, which is really cool. If anything survived through that copy of Storm Mirror Force or during the main phase 2, you do have the copy of Swords of Concealing Light that you can use to be able to flip them face down. Now, when you flip summon your copy of Lantern, if all the monsters your opponent has is face down, you can just swing at them for 800 and then immediately flip it back face down, which is the way the deck actually functions. Usually you'd want this to be another monster, but hey, we didn't draw one, which is totally fine. We can still have plenty of plays. So if our opponent attacks us again, you got that copy of Quaking Mirror Force that can then shift all your opponent's monsters into face down defense as well, which locks them face down as well, which I usually will bring up to you guys. Make sure you put a dice on top of the monsters that are flipped face down by Quaking, because sometimes your opponent will be like, oh, that wasn't flipped down by Quaking, which can happen sometimes. And then it's kind of a question of, did it really? I don't know. I can't remember which ones exactly. So we're going to draw into our next turn, and we're going to draw into a copy of Jiangshi. Jiangshi is going to be able to set itself to your side of the field and going to be able to flip itself up later to be able to get you additional draws. Or if your opponent attacks, you just can flip this. And, well, on the next turn, you're going to be able to flip it anyways to then start grabbing cards out of your deck, like your copies of your level 2 monsters or even your level 1 monsters that you have, like a copy of Mary and stuff like that. And keep in mind, we've mirror forced our opponent twice and been able to just immediately deal with our opponent. We haven't drawn into a lot of the mill cards in this hand, but it's showing you the basic premise of how the deck actually functions, which is very well. So let's go ahead and go into the next test hand and see what we can pull off. Now, that was basically what it does, and you guys might be looking at this and going, oh, that's kind of slow. Well, that's what Ghostricks do. They work very slowly. They slowly whittle down your opponent until they finally just have a bunch of monsters set, or they've lost so much card advantage that you basically just go in with your Ghostricks and attack them. That's the way that the deck has always functioned and the way that I've always played this deck. So let's go ahead and shuffle it up and see what we can actually pull off for the next hand. I will mention you guys too, you can trade out the Allure of Darknesses for 3 copies of Pot of Duality, because you don't special summon all that much on your turn, and you usually on the first turn are setting, so you can change it out if you want to for the Pot of Duality, if you want to go that route as well. So let's go ahead and shuffle up the deck and see what we can pull off for the next one. So for the next one, I'm going to go ahead and cut really quick and see what we can do. So we're going to draw, and we're going to draw into a Morphing Jar. Okay, this is where it's going to get interesting. We're going to draw into a Terraforming, a copy of Mansion, Mary, and a copy of Allure. So this is really good. We're going to go ahead and activate that copy of Terraforming to grab a copy of another card out of our deck, which is going to be another one of the field spells, just to kind of thin the deck a little bit. That's going to be really, really important to be able to just immediately get cards out of our hand. We're then going to I would go ahead and activate the copy of Allure to maybe grab a copy of Mirror Force or maybe a Storming Mirror Force out of the deck, which we're going to draw into 2 monsters. And I'm going to go ahead and banish one of my 2 Marys. We're then going to activate one of our 2 copies of Mansion directly on our side of the field to immediately just get that card out onto our side of the field. Once you get that out on your side of the field, I would set your copy of Morphing Jar and you pass. It's simple. You just pass. Now, when your opponent goes into the next turn and they try and attack you, you have the copy of Lantern that you can hit them with the Lantern and set it down. And then when you take damage, you can then use the copy of Mary to be able to set to your side of the field a copy of a Ghostrick monster, because it has the ability that when you take damage, you can discard this card and then special summon a Ghostrick monster from your deck, which I would usually summon out my copy of Jiangshi, or I would summon out Skeleton. It's totally up to you which one you want to grab. I would probably grab the copy of Jiangshi because it's going to get you an additional search. So go ahead and set that card to your side of the field and then shuffle the deck. Now, when your opponent goes off, they're going to attack you a couple of times probably, since you have the copy of Mansion, and then you go ahead and pass. So when you draw on your next turn, you draw into a Morphing Jar number 2. Okay, that's really good. Go ahead and set this card on your side of the field. Let's say that our opponent's already gone through 5 cards because they draw their initial 5. They went first, or they went second. So they're going to draw an additional card. And then let's go ahead and say that they used and searched in their deck, say, I don't know, 5 more times. Let's say they've gone through a total of 11 cards, just hypothetically, in their entire deck. Just so far, they've gone through 11. So when we flip summon this copy of Morphing Jar to our side of the field, we're going to discard our whole hand and get a total refresh, which is going to get us an additional 5 cards out of our opponent's hand, because they're going to discard their hand and then we're going to get 5 more. So we're at 16 cards out of their deck, hoping that they're playing a 40 card. We're going to go ahead and draw 5 more cards to totally replenish our entire hand. Now keep in mind, we've already normal summoned for the turn, but we just threw 3 sets that's going to protect us for the rest of the game. So we're going to go ahead and set these cards onto our side of the field. And to be honest with you guys, there's no telling how many cards you're going to be able to hit them with your copy of your Morphing Jar number 2. There's no telling. And seeing as how we did use our copy of our since we did use our copy of our Jiangshi and it was special summoned by Mary, you can flip summon your copy of Lantern and then flip summon your copy of Jiangshi, which will get you a level 1 or a 2 from your deck to your hand, which I would probably grab my copy of Doll. Doll is very important for your strategies. Now, we did already normal summon. We did set the Morphing Jar number 2, which is very important and really helps out the deck. So we're going to go ahead and re-flip summon these back face down by their own effect, and you're going to go ahead and pass. Now, we've gotten a lot of card advantage off that copy of Morphing Jar. You went from having, say, 1, 2, 3 cards on your side of the field to having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Like, right here, you have 7 cards that you just got off your copy, or 6 cards that you essentially just got on your side of the field that you wouldn't have regularly had off the Morphing Jar, which is ridiculous. There's a reason this card was actually banned for a while. So we're going to let our opponent go, and when they go, we're going to immediately activate, depending on what their plays are, we're going to activate the copy of Storming, or in the middle of their turn, you can activate the copy of Ghostrick Scare, which lets you target any number of face-down defense position monsters you control, change them to face-up attack, and then change the opponent's monsters face-down. But it's not about that. It's about flipping our copy of Morphing Jar that's going to shuffle everything back. And it does activate our effects as well. So you would go Chain Link 1, Chain Link 2, Jiangshi will go off and let us search a card out of the deck, which is a level 1 or level 2, because it has the ability that you will add 1 Ghostrick from your deck to your hand whose level is less than or equal to the amount that you had. So we're going to go ahead and add a copy of, say, I'd probably add a copy of... probably my copy of Lantern, because Lantern's going to give me a little additional protection. So once we flip that face up with our copy of Ghostrick Scare, guess what? You're going to go ahead and activate your Morphing Jar number 2, which is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4 on our side of the field, and there's no way to determine how many their opponent's going to have. We can hypothetically say that they're going to have 3 or 4 monsters, but if they're playing a very spell-heavy deck, like a Sky Striker build, then they're going to have a really tough time. But if they're playing a deck that's a very monster-heavy deck, they only may go through whatever monsters they had on the field, but it's still going to board wipe them. But if they're playing a very high-level deck, this card only lets us special summon back level 4 lower monsters. So this card is very, very pivotal to be able to use in this particular play. So we're going to go ahead and shuffle the deck. We did flip 4, so we get to hit until we get 4 monsters that we can summon, or that gets into the graveyard. If it's level 5 or level 4 or higher, then higher than 4, then we just immediately send it to the graveyard, but it counts towards the count. So we get a Morphing Jar right off the bat. We get a copy of Jiangshi right off the bat. We get a copy of Morphing Jar number 2 and a copy of Storming Mirror Force, which will go to the grave, and a copy of Allure goes to the grave, and another Jiangshi. We just filled up our field with a Searcher and an additional flip that if our opponent attacks into this card, we're going to get more advantage and more mill, that we're going to hit them with the Morphing Jar to discard their hand, and we're going to have the copy of Morphing Jar number 2. This is when the deck starts snowballing, is when you go into an empty jar style play, where you also have the copy of this, the Ghostrick Vanish, that can protect your monsters by revealing a Ghostrick in your hand, or you can use the Storming Mirror Force if your opponent's going to attack you. The Mansion's also going to protect you. At this point, they potentially could be milled out upwards of, right here, they could be milled out upwards of 25 to 30 cards out of their deck. I have seen it when I play test. At this point, with a field like this, they could easily be milled out this many cards. Easily. Like, it's not even a question at that point. So let's go ahead and see what we can do for another test hand. Now, again, if you're playing against Sky Strikers and you flip a card like this, it's pretty much an instant win. Like, if they have any monsters, if they have more than 1 or 2 monsters on the field, if they have like 2 on the field and you flip this, it's game. Like, they're not going to be playing a whole lot of hand traps. And if they're playing anything like a Demise in their deck, it's over. And I know that's a deck that's not very prevalent, but it's the only deck that, right off the top of my head, that I can think of that has a lot of spells in the main deck. Just something like that. This deck was really good back when Demise builds were around, because it would just totally decimate an opponent's deck, because they'd be playing very little monsters, and the Morphing Jar would flip, and they would be totally messed up because they wouldn't be able to go off. So let's go ahead and shuffle the deck up and see what we can do for another play. And as you've seen, I haven't touched the extra deck this whole time. You don't need it all that much in the Skeleton Mill build. You don't need to go into the extra deck because you're losing monsters, where your Morphing Jar number 2 is going to get you more advantage. So let's go ahead and see what we can do for another play, and go ahead and cut the deck. So Morphing Jar right off the bat. That's insane. Morphing Jar number 2 right off the bat. Another Mary, another copy of Allure, and a Fairy. This is really good because you're going to go ahead and drop the copy of Allure and then immediately go 1 and 2, and we're great. We are golden because you have the copy of Storming and you have the copy of Quaking. Your opponent's not, there's not a lot of decks out there right now that are doing back row hate. There's just not. And so you have a lot of advantage by playing the Quaking and the Storming because it's going to be able to prevent you from going into plays. So we're going to go ahead and you got to banish off your copy of Allure. So I'm going to go ahead and banish my copy of Fairy because the Mary will help me out a lot more. And in this particular instance, I'm going to go ahead and set both of these, play around the Mech Knight, and go ahead and set your copy of Morphing Jar number 2. So your opponent goes off into their plays, they're going to go, oh, cool. You set one and pass, that's great. You set one pass, that's fine. And then you hit them with a Quaking. And they're like, oh no, you just hit me with Quaking. And then you pass. Let's say they had a Link monster. Instead of using the Quaking, you're going to use the Storming to bait out a negation out of like a Dragoons or something like that, or you're just going to bait a negation. So when they do attack, they're going to have one less negation here. They're going to try and replay the battle. They're going to swing into this. It's going to shuffle all their monsters back into the deck. Let's say they had 5 monsters on the field. They're going to hit at least 10 cards probably off the top that are just going to be a big problem for them, that they're going to start with 5. They're going to hit another 5 off the, or another 10 off the top of the deck with your copy of Morphing Jar number 2 probably. If they have 5 monsters, best case scenario, on their side of the field, they get shuffled back. We don't get a monster because this was destroyed by battle at the resolution, so you don't get a monster and you don't shuffle anything back. But the really funny thing is if they do hit a monster or they hit like spells or traps, they don't count. They just immediately go to the grave. So we're going to go ahead and draw for turn and draw into another Mary. And we're going to go ahead and set that copy of Morphing Jar. So our opponent's going to go off. They're going to be a little bit wary of what we're playing face down. And they're going to go ahead and swing into it again. And they're going to hit another copy of Morphing Jar, which they're going to draw for turn, which is going to give them a 1. And then you're going to hit them with, again, the copy of the Morphing Jar, which is going to give them an additional 5. And then another 1 off the top, which you're basically going to mill them out at now 21, at least 21 cards if they didn't search this turn. The Morphing Jar is, yes, it does give them more advantage, and you're going to get to draw 5 cards, which, hey, I only had 2 cards, and now I'm drawing into 5 more cards, which I just drew into a copy of my Lantern, which I can then special summon to my field in face down defense if they attack me, which is really, really good. And I had the Quaking Mirror Force that I could flip and stop my opponent from attacking me as well, and flip their monsters into face down defense. So when I go into my turn, I'm going to draw, and I'm going to draw into another copy of Quaking, which is why I play the 4 copies of Mirror Force, or the 4 different copies of Mirror Force in my particular deck. Go ahead and set this, because this is going to be really good, and then set your copy of Jiangshi on your side of the field, because your copy of Spectre is on your, or your copy of Lantern is on your side of the field. Now pass, they're going to draw into another card, which is going to get them out at least 5, 10, 15, 20, 22 on their turn. Now, again, this is something that you're going to have to test yourself and be able to kind of figure out how many, depending on what deck you're playing against, how many they're milling out. In some decks like Burning Abyss, this is actually really good for them to mill out a bunch of cards because a lot of their effects are going to go off. But it's kind of one of those things where it's going to depend on how many cards they can feasibly mill to the graveyard before they have nothing left in their deck. And they're playing that you're going on the razor's edge, really, because depending on how many cards they have in their deck that trigger in the graveyard when they go to the graveyard, it depends on how much advantage they're going to get. Because if you're sending stuff, like your opponent does immediately go for Dragoons, and you hit them and hit their copy of Dark Magician and Red Eyes with a copy of, say, your Morphing Jar number 2, you're going to have that added advantage to be able to just hit all those cards that are key combo pieces, and it turns multiple cards into their deck into bricks, which is hilarious, I will mention, especially if you just hit that one of Red Eyes Fusion and then they start drawing into the copies of Red Eyes and Dark Magician. This deck is just mean for that, and I will mention to you guys that is really mean, and it really does help what you're doing in this particular build. And then with this, you have the Quaking, you have the Storming set, which is going to block at least 2 attacks, and then you have your copy of Ghostrick Knight, and you have your copy of Jiangshi and Lantern that are going to help you out as well. And if we draw, we're going to draw into another Lantern, which can be special summoned if our opponent attacks, and you have this really good board that's going to help you out overall to get some really insane plays. So I think that pretty much explains the way that you play this deck. You can go into some XZ plays where you have stuff like you have 2 copies of Lantern, and then you overlay for a Dullahan, and then you go from Dullahan to your copy of your Angel of Mischief, and then you'll attack with the Angel of Mischief and your opponent will stop it or something, or it'll stalemate, and then you go into Zeus during main phase 2, and then you blow board. So you have a little bit of advantage that if your opponent does do something that you can't out, or they stop your copy of your Morphing Jar or Morphing Jar number 2. I will mention, you guys, though, the majority of players are not going to stop the Morphing Jar because they're going to go, oh, cool, I'm getting 5 more cards, which is fine, but if they lose in the long run, it doesn't really bother us. Yes, it gives them card advantage, but it also gives us card advantage, which is why it's very important in this particular deck. But or you can, instead of going for Angel of Mischief, you can half the attack of a monster, go for Angel of Mischief then, and then go for Zeus during main phase 2, which gives you all that advantage as well. Or instead of going for this, you can go for a copy of Downward Magician and then go for a Zeus as well, depending on if your opponent has anything set, which is another thing to keep in mind while you're playing this deck. So that's just it for this deck, guys. I hope you did enjoy it. It's a really good deck to play with if you're trying to frustrate somebody, because you're going to kind of slow down the game, interact with them a little bit more, and kind of go into an old school kind of empty jar-ish kind of build to be able to kind of mill your opponent out. The cards that I've thought about running in this deck also, I will mention, you guys, is Needleworm. Needleworm was another card that I thought about running. Needleworm Nest is another card that I've thought about running in this deck because it will mill your opponent out to be more like an empty jar build. And the skeleton does come in handy, but you're usually focused on using the jar cards a little bit more to be able to go into some crazy plays. So that's it for this one, guys. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell so you can become part of Notification Squad, and definitely tell me what you think of this one down in the comments down below. And we'll see you guys in the next video. See you later, guys.